Hi there. This is History on the Go. Thanking you guys for listening, watching my videos in the past. Today I want to talk about Africans or black people, depending on how you want to see it. Africans, black people, I'm using two words together, in the 18th century in England. Very exciting topic. History is exciting for me anyway. I love history. So when I study history, it's for my understanding, to get like a understanding of how things came to be. But today I want to talk about black people here in England in the 18th century. When we talk about the 18th century, for some of us, sometimes we think of the word 18th century, we think of 18, and then we go up to 19th century, or we go 1801, 1802. No, it's not like that. 18th century is really the 1700s going up to the end of the 1700s. It's a bit confusing. I still find it confusing, but so we're talking about the 1700s, which is the 18th century. Weird. So I want to bring this topic to you. First of all, I want to share a couple of things. I want you to hang on there. I don't want you to be switching off and going to my other channel. Why? You could be learning something here. Don't be put off. If you don't like the way I look, it's okay. Just listen to what I'm saying. Before you can learn anything, you have to take time to listen. So listen, watch, and don't actually have your preconceived ideas blocking what I'm saying, but just listen to what I'm saying, and then you can make a comment. Then you can think about it, okay? So in the 18th century, there was a lot of black people here. More than we actually thought. I remember, as I've always mentioned this, when I'm in school here in England, I grew up here, I was born here. I didn't know anything about black people being here. I remember one or two stories, books in here mentioning sort of period history, and in the story you might hear some mention of a black character. So you did hear some things. Anyway, in the 18th century here in England, according to the Gentleman's Magazine, the Gentleman's Magazine was a magazine that was around, I think it was founded around about 1700s, in the early part of 1700s. So it's an old magazine, something we can have some reliability on, because it was right in the period I'm talking about. And so they reckon there was 20,000 black people, black servants, they said, 20,000 black servants in London. They didn't use the word slaves because they were servants. And I'm not saying that some of these people was treating their servants as slaves. That's another story altogether. But according to the magazine, there was 20,000 black servants in London. That would be about 2% of London's population. Now, modern historians, they've kind of scrutinized this, and they've, according to, looking at, registrations of baptisms and different registration of records, they're now saying that the figure could be around about 10,000 black people in London at the time. Some say Lord Mansfield, who was a lord at the time, said that there was about 15,000 black people. Some say that the figures what we're getting, like thousands, is to do with all of Britain, but the Gentleman's Magazine said there was 20,000 in London, and there was another gazette that said there was 30,000 blacks in total in the whole of England. So we did have these articles, we did have certain people give these figures, and they're all in their thousands. What do you think of that? Now, some people, through me and through other historians, are getting to understand that there was a lot more people here in the 18th century, which is a long time. 18th century, that's 1700s going up to the late 1700s. And so some of these black people ended up here through the triangular trade that was going on. People would bring their enslaved peoples to England, ship captains, plantation owners would come back from Jamaica, from St. Vincent, from St. Kitts, and they would come to England and they would come in pomp and pride and show off their wealth, because sugar was like oil. It was like oil, but it was a brutal affair, as we know. You know, I'm not here to talk about the brutality of slavery. This is about talking about real lives here in London and how those people lived here in London or in other parts of England, but mainly in London I'm talking about. And so let me go in a little bit just to teach you, just to show you some of these characters that were here and what kind of lives they had. Some of these people lived in poverty, obviously. A lot of people lived in poverty, lived a bad life. There was poverty all over England anyway. Not only black people were in poverty, but you know, when you're from the outside and you look different, sometimes you end up being at the worst bottom of the ladder. But then in the midst of all that, you had black people that was doing things that the elite or those people in monarchy or those people in education would look on and say, that person he's doing something that we need to take note of. So you had somebody like Ignatius Sancho, who was an enslaved boy on a ship. He was born on a ship. His mother was actually pregnant, and so his mother's pregnant, has him on the ship on the way from Africa to the Caribbean. I'm trying to remember exactly how he ended up in England. For some reason, I checked it out years ago and I haven't checked it out more recently. But I know Ignatius Sancho lived in London. So let's forget about how he got here. But he was in London because we have a lot of recordings and paintings of him. And Ignatius Sancho ended up writing a lot of poetry. He ended up writing songs, and he mixed with a lot of royalty or people of high standing, high circles or whatever. And so they took note of him because they had these ideas in those days, in the 1700s, and probably the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. They had this idea that black people was lower than white people. Black people didn't have the same equality in terms of intellect, and so forth. And so when somebody like Ignatius Sancho was a black man, was writing this poetry and writing these songs, they just was amazed. And so they had to sort of reconsider whether black people was unequal to white people. It sounds crazy now because we live in a time now where we tend to be a bit more understanding and a bit more enlightened when it comes to these things. And so those types of thinking is what kind of trickled down to create racism throughout the decades after. But that was just one small story of one person. I will go into that person a lot more deeper in another video. Ignatius Sancho. And then you had someone like Equiano, Olaudah Equiano. I mentioned a bit about him before, but in relation to this, he was here in the 1700s also. So we have some important characters, Ignatius Sancho, or Olaudah Equiano. And he was living in Blackheath in England. But the most important part of his story is that we need to understand that someone like him and someone like Sancho was able to influence the thoughts of the British society, British community. So that's why this history is quite important, because history is about people that influence the history of a nation or history of a people, influence the thoughts of a people. So these men influence the thoughts by what they did. You know, what are you doing to influence the thoughts of your present day situation or people around you? These men wrote. Ignatius Sancho wrote poetry, and Olaudah Equiano, after he got his freedom, he wrote a book, autobiography or a biography about his life starting from Africa to Barbados to Virginia and then to England. And so he had and also his life on the ship, because he was a sailor on a ship also with the captain. He was also a gunpowder boy. He also experienced war as a boy. Imagine a 12-year-old boy being on a warship. Being on a warship and actually experiencing men dying around him. That's what Olaudah Equiano writes in his book. His book is absolutely brilliant. A lot of people don't actually realize that this book is like a time machine. It will take you back to the 1700s, to Nigeria, to Barbados, to Virginia, and to England. And on the ship and the seas, you will hear stories that you would think was like fiction, because it's so amazing what he writes about. Anyway, I've got a bit of noise in my flat, and I'm hoping that it's not coming out. It's not coming out on my video. I'm going to continue. So that we're talking about two characters in the 1700s, and we're talking about how important it is that we have some understanding of black presence in Britain. Olaudah Equiano, one of the most significant thing we need to take note of is that the book that he wrote about his life was able to influence the abolition of the slave trade, and then went on to influence the abolition of the slavery itself. And so people like Wilberforce, Thomas, and also Thomas Clarkson, and those guys, probably even Granville Sharp, these guys are three notable abolitionists, English abolitionists. They would have had some connection with this book, and I know Wilberforce did. We know Wilberforce was an MP and helped to bring about the vote to end the slave trade. Before I go any further, just to add, because sometimes you have to add little bits, pieces into what I'm saying, is that we can't dismiss that the end of the slave trade and the end of slavery was also brought about by black people. My talk is never about seeing black people as only as victims. Yes, in reality, a lot of us was victims. You can't deny that. But in that state of so-called victimhood, there were people that rose up out of that victimhood and became great leaders. We had in Jamaica, Paul Bogle and many other people. Nanny. We have in St. Vincent, we have Chateauwa. Chateauwa, St. Vincent's, where my people come from. He was a great leader that led the Black Caribs, the Garifuna people, and he fought against the English alongside with the French. You know, these wars, people just choose sides according to what they want. So the French was fighting with the Garifuna against the English, because the French and the English have always been enemies. So this world is complex, I'm telling you. So what I'm trying to say here is that we've always had, I see my black people, my ancestors, I see them as heroes. Some of them may have been taken from Africa and sold into slavery by other Africans, but I see them as heroes, because anybody that could survive that ship journey from Africa to the Caribbean, or to America, North America, or to South America, anybody that survived that had strong spirit, strong mental attitude, strong physical strength, because it was a nightmare to be in those ships at the bottom of a ship, to survive that. And anybody that even died in that, I still see them as people of courage. Anyway, so Olaudah's book influenced the end of the slave trade, so that's a great thing. We also had other influences, other people in the 1700s that came to, or other people that came probably just outside of the 1700s. I think Phyllis Wheatley came from America, and she wrote poetry also, and she was an example for these so-called academics to say, look, a black person, look, they can write poetry. black people can actually think, they can actually write, they can actually be creative. It took these people to change the thoughts of those academics. And imagine that was how many hundreds of years ago, and still some people's thoughts towards the darker races is still one of they are not as good. And so we continue the fight and the emancipation of all of the minds of humanity, because those people that think like that, their minds are in a state of confusion, in a state of the mind is not whole, the mind is not, thinking the right things. Anyway, so black presence in the 18th century. Influx of black men came to England after the 1780s, and that influx came from America. And these guys were from the American War of Independence. And so the British, when the British started, when the war started, the British offered all of the black enslaved people, offered them, or the men, I think it was just the men, offered them freedom if they would come to fight for the British. And so a lot of these enslaved people escaped, and all types of things, ways of getting to the battlefront, and they ended up fighting for the British. The British promised them freedom, but the British lost the war, obviously, so freedom wasn't going to be in America. So a lot of these enslaved blacks, some of them ended up going to Nova Scotia in Canada, and some of them ended up coming to England. So we had a whole lot of black men who fought in this war of independence coming to England in different times. And a lot of them ended up on the streets impoverished, because one of the things that happens after war is that, these governments, they promise you certain things and you don't get it. And in those days, black people, without sounding as if like this is about victimhood, black people were generally undervalued. And so they didn't have that, they wasn't looked after. They ended up on the streets. There was a name for them, the poor blacks. And there were certain caricatures of images that was drawn at the time, showing these black men on the streets begging and so forth. And so that was the other way a lot of these guys came into England. And then in the middle of all that, or in between of all that and after, was personalities like Bill Richmond. Bill Richmond was actually an African American who came here in the late 1700s, and who fell into boxing because of his natural skills. He got into a bit of racial problems in Yorkshire, I think it was Yorkshire, and he just took out a couple guys, I think it was, flattened them on the floor, and somebody took note of him. Next thing you knew, he was into bare fist boxing, and I think it was a legal thing at the time, and they just used to have these big competitions throughout Britain. He rose to be one of the second greatest, or second best boxer in that type of boxing in England. But the fight that he had that would have given him the title of the best, they literally jumped into the ring and broke his wrist, because they couldn't. It was just too much for anybody to think that this black man was going to become the best boxer in England. And so that's what happened to him. But the person that I think he lost that fight to, I think it was Bill Cribb, I think his name was. They actually became friends. And it's funny how these stories work out. But Bill Richmond became a very important person. He mixed with royalty. He actually set up a training school, a boxing school. It was the first boxing academy in England that was set up on the same spot where Trafalgar Square is right now. And Trafalgar Square, the reason why the boxing academy isn't there now, maybe it wouldn't have been there now anyway, but the reason why it was moved is because they built Trafalgar Square, and then you had Nelson's column, tribute to Admiral Nelson was built on that square. And so that boxing arena or boxing academy was actually, demolished. He actually trained a person named Lord Byron, who would have been, Lord Byron was a very important person, and other people like Lord Byron he actually trained. And then he also trained another boxer from America called Tom Mullenix. And Tom Mullenix was another great boxer that came from America. Yes, so in terms of what happened to all of these black people from the 18th century, what happened to them when it came to like the Victorian period, which was in the 19th century, because there was less black people here in Britain at that time. But there were some notable characters like Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who was a black composer who was born in the Victorian period and died in the Victorian period, but was very notable. People knew him. There's also people like Mary Seacole came here from Jamaica in that period, and she lived here for a couple of years. She came here twice actually, and she came here from Panama to England to try to join the nursing corps when the war broke out in Russia, which is called the Crimean War. And so she was a very important woman, voted greatest Black Britain basically in history. She's very important woman, and I will talk about her definitely, because she is an amazing woman. And so what happened between the 18th century until up to the Victorian period, less black people here in Britain, and that's because the people in that century, the 18th century, they mixed with the English population, the main population, and over time, over generations, then those people, their great descent or their descendants actually became white. That happened a lot in history. For example, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, a person that I spoke about before in one of my other videos, he was mixed race already, or mixed heritage. His father was black Sierra Leonean from West Africa, and his mother was from Holborn in England, in London. English woman, white woman. And so, but then he married an English woman. He was mixed already, and his children became quarter black. And then, as far as I understand, when those children grew up, they married into or had relations with white English again. So those children is definitely going to be looking white. Another example of that is a guy named Francis Barber, who came here, who was brought here. I think he was a grown man and he's brought it from Jamaica. I think it was Jamaica. His master he wasn't really a master, because the guy used him as a servant and then treated him as a son, educated him and all sorts of stuff. That was sort of a type of relationship what they had. And when he died, the person that he worked for, the person left him an allowance. So he was given a big allowance. So he lived in England he looked like he was part mixed already from Jamaica. But then his descendants are now white, 100% white. They look white. And so we know this has happened in British history. So there's a lot of English people walking around in the streets of London or any other city may have some African DNA lurking in the background. It's only when you have these DNA tests that these things show up. There was a story I saw this on television actually. There was two women, English women, from I think it was Cornwall. They one of them had a sickness, and then when they had a blood test done, one of them was found to have sickle cell. And we know sickle cell only happens to people from African ancestry, and some of those people in the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean populations, some of them have African DNA from sub-Saharan Africans, because due to the actual invasion of the Africans from Morocco and from Senegal, the Moorish people, the black Moorish people, some of those people went into Europe, and some of their DNA is actually in the Mediterranean. So you'd have some Mediterraneans will have some sickle cell trait, which is really relating to blacks from sub-Saharan Africa. And so these two women who had this blood test done realized they've got this sickle cell trait, one of them, and then they just thought, what, that's strange. And then when they started to go into it, they realized they had a black ancestor that was living in somewhere like Liverpool, and we can't remember where he came from, whether it was Jamaica, but in Jamaica or one of the other islands. But he was a black man that was in England, and then they didn't know about him, because sometimes people would, when time goes on, some people are ashamed of having a black ancestry. Some people celebrate it, and some people are ashamed of it. Some people, it's just the way it is. I'm not even going to go into the politics and the actual racial thing about that. But I'm glad that if you've stayed to the end, well done. I'm sure you've picked up something new. It's worth staying to the end, isn't it? It's worth staying to the end. Anyway, thank you for watching. There's going to be a lot more videos. I don't know whether I missed anything out. Obviously, I've missed some things out because I'm just talking. I'm just gathering information. I'm just giving it to you. And I know whatever comes out now is what you need to hear. I will add more to this talk and always build more layers onto it. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe to this channel so this channel will grow. And please like this video if you like it. Don't just walk away if you liked it and don't like it. Give me a thumbs up. Thank you.